afternoon and welcome to today's CERIAS Information Security Seminar brought to you from Purdue University. Our guest today is John Oritz. John is currently a senior computer engineering consultant for SRA International. In this position, he researches information hiding techniques and steganography software, assesses the security and feasibility of advanced DoD security applications, examines and deobfuscates malware, and develops forensic tools. Prior to SRA, he spent 5 years at General Dynamics developing source code and network traffic analysis techniques and software. In a second role, Mr. Oritz teaches computer science and electrical engineering courses at University of Texas at San Antonio. John?
All right, thank you very much. How's everybody doing today? It's nasty weather out there. It's a little warmer down in Texas. So anyway, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me. And we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so which one of these pictures has some hidden data? Which one? And why do you say that? Oh, you don't have a microphone back there? Why do you say that? Okay.
I thought the lighter line had stayed. That statement is almost incorrect in probability 1.
Yeah, well, you have 50% chance of guessing right, and you did guess right. Well, let's look at it closer. The little bit of darker doesn't help. And here's a closer look. And can you see any difference transitioning on that screen? It's hard to see on this screen. Picture 1, picture 2. You might be able to see a small difference, if at all. You have to look very close, comparing side by side, but just because there's a difference doesn't mean one is wrong and the other is right. Could easily adjust the contrast and brighten it a little bit. Here's what's hiding in one of the pictures.
Scary.
Yeah, so that picture is actually embedded in one of the other pictures, and we'll talk about that technique a little bit later on. So for today, here's the agenda. The attention getter, that was just done. I need to have at least for the first few slides, the slide actually appear up there. Thank you. A little bit of word about SRA, company I work for. A little bit about me, just very briefly. Joel told you some things. I'll share a few other things, and then there's other things I won't share. Remember, it's steganography, not stenography. A lot of people call me up about my class and say, well, what kind of writing instruments do you need? No, it's not stenography, it's steganography. We will talk a little bit about hiding in the least significant bit, but from what I understand, most of you are pretty familiar with that. But then we'll do a couple more advanced techniques. Bit plane complexity segmentation, a little more sophisticated substitution technique. We'll talk about high capacity and JPEG images, another technique. And then if we have time, I know time's an issue here, we'll talk about echo hiding in audio. And then if we still have time, which I doubt, but we'll try, I can do some demonstrations. Certainly I'm willing to share some of the programs that I've done, so you can kind of play with it on your own. If you're interested, you can email me or we can make it available or something like that. And then any questions, comments. And you can ask questions anytime, okay, if something comes up. All right, SRA, I'm not going to read through all that. Basically, we do a lot of work in the intelligence and information community. They do a lot of work in a lot of other areas too, in health and so forth. We're all over the globe. Okay, so pretty much anywhere you want to live, SRA has some type of office there. Okay, most of the offices are in Virginia. We have a small office down in Texas. That's where I work. And I've been working with them for about 3 years, and I enjoy it. Some of you are going to graduate soon. If you want to give me your card or send a resume or something, feel free. You know, I'll take the referral bonus, trust me. All right, so I graduated from Rose-Hulman in 1988. I'm sure all of you have heard of that. Joined the Air Force as a communications officer, got to do lots of things. Teaching networking class was one. Automate a database, or not automate a database, but automate a process using a database. And planning unit picnics. That was really one of my favorite tasks there. The commander told me, if you can't even plan a unit picnic, then we can't trust you to do something important. So, because I complained about it, wanted to do, I just graduated, I've got a degree in engineering, and I'm planning a picnic. Yeah. Then I went to the Air Force Institute of Technology in near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and got a couple master's degrees in computer engineering and electrical engineering. So I have a very broad background. I don't have a lot of very specific background. It went from VLSI to computer architecture to software engineering, communications, so covered a lot of stuff there. Then I joined Trident, which was bought by Veridian, which was bought by General Dynamics, and Joel already read some of these things, so I'll skip that. Did some neat projects. Then I joined RABA, which was bought by SRA. So I'm kind of waiting for the third purchase to take place here. It could happen someday. And basically doing the same kind of work for a different company. So one of the most interesting was to analyze some DoD security programs. They had several companies that developed different programs to provide different types of security. And I was able to analyze those and see what their weaknesses were, if they could be broken, and so forth. So I've had a lot of fun projects since I've been there, and I continue to have fun projects. It's a very interesting type work in computer security. Also, at the same time, I started teaching at University of Texas in San Antonio. Actually, there wasn't a job posting. I just sent them my resume and said I'd like to teach, and I had a few years' experience, and they interviewed me and let me teach. And once I did okay, then I asked them to develop a steganography class. And that's kind of what this presentation is based on, a few elements of the class, but I teach an entire semester of steganography. All right. Information hiding. That's the branch of computer science that deals with concealing the existence of information. Steganography is one subtopic under information hiding. There's also watermarking, which is more prevalent, actually, because of the large commercial interest. Covert channels, not quite so prevalent. And then anonymity. And I find very little research, at least relatively speaking, on anonymity versus versus steganography or watermarking, especially. Lots of disciplines covered. Digital signal processing probably being the biggest discipline required for steganography, but data compression, the human visual and auditory systems are important because it's how we perceive the information that matters. Data compression, discrete math, information theory. How many of y'all are familiar with information theory? Just kind of curious. All right, a few of you. So you know what entropy is, right? And not from thermodynamics class. And so all these science and disciplines come together in producing steganographic content. It literally means covered writing. You've heard of a stegosaurus before. That's a covered dinosaur. The steganography is covered writing. That's where the term comes from. And then it borrows some terms from cryptography. Okay, plain text is used in cryptography. You can use that in steganography. Cover text, that's the cover file. Now that's something you don't have any analogous to in cryptography, is a cover file. Because cryptography has the plain text and the ciphertext, and that's it. Well, steganography, you have this third file. That's the cover file. And the cover file does make a difference, as we'll see shortly. And then, of course, you have the stegotext or stego object. That's the cover file mixed with the embedded data. Concept of hiding is not new. Okay, one of my favorite stories was reading about how the Greeks would shave the head of a slave and write a message on the head, wait for the hair to grow back, and then send them off. Some of us don't make quite as good message carriers as others, which is true in steganography. Some cover files are not good as others. World War I, World War II, the Civil War, which is not up here. They used some quilt patterns. In the 80s, there was somebody leaking cabinet documents in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. And so she had the word processors adjusted so each one would put a different fingerprint on it so then they could identify the leaker. So the idea is not new. What's new is that in the last, well, it's not quite that new now, but it's been around since 1995. Of course, maybe to the undergraduate students, I guess they've been born since 1995, but they weren't very old when that started around. But when the internet started to take off, that's when research really started to kick up in steganography. About that time, there was probably a couple hundred papers published. I checked 2 years ago, tried to download as many as I could. I got about 2,500, and that was 2 years ago. So I'm sure there's many more published since then. Main principles of cryptography also apply to steganography. Okay, this idea of security by obscurity. People always want to use it. It always fails. But the idea is that the security should be in the key, not in the algorithm. You have to make the broad assumption that the opponent is going to get the algorithm. They're going to get your program somehow, some way. You know, a big briefcase full of money is one way. That works. A gun to the head is another way that works, and any way in between. So if you really want to have a good steganographic system, then your security needs to hide with the key and not with the algorithm. That's called Kirchhoff's principle, and that applies very well to steganography. Many systems have failed. Probably the most prominent is the CSS system for DVDs, where the 17-year-old kid in the Netherlands cracked that code with a Linux box. I don't know who they hired to write the original security. Obviously, it wasn't Purdue students, right? Wasn't Rose-Hulman students either. I don't know. I don't know who.
It's done
In Japan?
It's not about Hitachi.
Oh, okay.
It's for satellite communication.
Oh, they're the ones that came up with that scheme?
Yeah, and DVD Johns didn't really break it for everybody.
Okay. All right. I'll be interested to hear that. In any case, other systems have failed with the security by obscurity concept. We can use, everybody thinks of steganography as hiding images, okay, which is true. Images are probably the most prevalently researched, but you can hide in audio, you can hide in video, you can hide in text, you can hide in executables. There's several published papers for hiding in the code of an executable. Basically, just about any file type is possible to come up with a hiding technique for. Some are better than others. I mean, a plain text file that you can open in Notepad, there's not a lot you can do with it. Insert some spaces or tabs or something like that, but you still can hide there. Primary goal of steganography is to hide data so that it can't be found even if one is looking for it. To my knowledge, no one's achieved that at a perfect 100% level, but it doesn't mean it's not possible. There is a perfectly secure crypto system. Anybody know what that is? Yeah.
One-time pad.
That's right, the one-time pad. If employed properly, it's perfectly secure, 100%. So there's several goals of steganography. Security being one of them. Can't find it by looking at it. Can't find it with a computer. Okay, that's kind of two different types of security. And then capacity. Steganography typically has a high capacity goal. Get as much data in there as possible without being noticed. And then robustness, which is to be resistant to image manipulations or audio manipulations of some sort. Contrast, brightness, shifting, cropping, that kind of stuff. Steganography generally doesn't try very hard to be robust. That's what watermarking does. It's secure if it can't be detected, even if the attacker knows your algorithm or even has your program. Okay? Otherwise, it's not secure. And so you think, can it be seen or heard? Okay? Can it be detected statistically? There's a lot of research in that area. Does it leave signatures? And I don't mean statistical signatures, but signatures like altering the quantization table in a JPEG file for a certain purpose, okay, which one of the techniques in the papers does. That's a signature. All you have to do is look and find the JPEG quantization table, look at that bit, and say, oh, this bit's a 1 or this byte's a 1, and must be using this steganography program. Several levels of failure, detection being the biggest, but extraction and destruction are others as well. Okay, in some cases you don't care if it's detected, but you don't want it to be able to be extracted or destroyed. Now, clearly you can take the file and delete it, and that will destroy it. But destroying it in such a way as to leave the cover file in a good shape. Capacity, how much data can an image hold? There's a physical limit, assuming you don't want the original cover file to change size. In some cases, the size may not matter too much, okay? Or as long as it's close. If you have a bitmap that's 3 or 4 megabytes, that's not unusual for a bitmap. If you have one that's 30 megabytes, well, unless you're doing some specialized work, that's kind of unusual. You wouldn't find too many floating around the internet. Okay, so the idea is to try to maximize the amount of data for a particular cover file. And robustness, I'm not going to read all these. You can look at them later if you like, but how well the file can hold up to manipulations. And there's a lot. The graphical manipulations, analog to digital conversion, digital analog conversion, such as scanning and printing. You don't necessarily typically think of that as analog and digital conversion, but it is. Faxing something. If you're trying to watermark something and protect it, and all you have to do is fax it to somebody else to destroy the watermark, and then it's not much protection, right? And then there's robustness, and that's achieved by redundant encoding. So there's going to be a trade-off between robustness and capacity, because as we put more information in there redundantly to provide robustness, we lose capacity that would otherwise be available for the hidden data. All right, some classifications. We have the substitution system. That's kind of the straightforward least significant bit type technique. And talk about that briefly, along with BPCS is another substitution system. Transform domain techniques, that's where you actually hide kind of in the math of compressed images for one, or compressed audio could be. I've got an example of that with JPEGs. Spread spectrum, you spread your message out amongst the various frequencies in the file. Statistical is kind of interesting. You alter some statistical characteristic of the cover file. A little bit more difficult to do. Distortion techniques, not very highly researched. There's a few out there because you require the original file, but you distort the cover file, and then the receiver needs both the original file and the distorted file and compares them to get the message back out. And then cover generation methods, also not highly researched, but use some mathematical technique to generate a cover in such a way as to convey a message. All right, least significant bits. Substitution. Replace information in the cover with the hidden data. Now I've got a picture of a mandrel coming up, and this least significant bit technique that I use for demonstration is kind of a very simplified technique. Basically, it will take one image and hide it in another image. Okay? Really, you could generalize that and hide anything within an image typically, but for demo purposes, I found this is a good one to talk about. So probably a lot of you know this already, but images are composed of pixels. Each pixel, if it's a color image, may have a different color component. And so the 24-bit bitmap that has the 16 million plus colors that you've all heard about has 8 red, 8 bits for blue, 8 bits for green. Okay? And so with this color image, what we're going to do is we're going to take the top 4 bits off the image to be hidden and substitute those for the lower 4 bits of the image to hide in. And then we'll produce our cover file, and we'll look at that. Of course, you may think, wow, that's half the information. 4 bits out of 8 is half. Well, it is half the capacity, but most of the information is stored in the upper 4 bits, so you still have a good image, even with the lower 4 bits replaced with this other image. Of course, images with solid backgrounds, like a solid black or solid white, are going to make a poorer cover file than something like this mandrel you're about to see. So here, I've got a Dalmatian hiding in 4 bits of the mandrel. Okay? Okay, can you tell this time which one? Yeah, you're just guessing again. Yeah, I put it on the right. Maybe I should swap that up next time. So it is in the right, but it's not because you can tell by looking at it. All right, so here's the Dalmatian. Now, this one I truly don't know if you can see. Can you tell up there on the screen that the right image has the mandrel in there?
Yeah, a little bit of red.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you're looking over there. Yeah, you can see, if you look at it on a computer monitor, I don't know about that screen, but you can see a little bit of red there. So it's starting to bleed through, okay, because you've got such a solid image here. So the Dalmatian doesn't make as good a cover file as the mandrel does. So, of course, in this case, we've used all 4 bits. If you use 3 bits, or 2 bits, or 1 bit, then you're not going to be able to see it, even in the Dalmatian. And there's an example for that. So with this very simple program, I allowed it to vary between 1 and 7 bits. So it can take just 1 bit from the hidden data and put in the least significant bit of the cover, and up to 7. Okay, and we'll see a few pictures with that. All right, so here's Peppers and the mandrel. And I don't know, can you tell on that one, Joel, with the mandrel, that can you see the peppers bleeding through?
You see some bleed through across the nose on the mandrel.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I can tell, it's hard to tell. If I see anything, it's a little bit of what would be the mandrel's nose in the green pepper, maybe a little bit. But if I didn't know it was there, I wouldn't see it.
Right. So this is a case where if you were just receiving images, you didn't think anything, you didn't suspect anything, you probably wouldn't notice. But if you look at it close, you can see that a little bit of the peppers bleeds through. And this is with 5 bits replaced. All right. Now, clearly, with 6 and 7 bits replaced, you can see it very easily. And also, there's another effect that happens, and that is the mandrel starts to lose some detail. Because now that you replace 6 and 7 bits, not only are you putting this other image there, but you're taking away the detail information of the mandrel, so it starts to look more and more like a cartoon as opposed to an actual picture. Now, of course, with the Dalmatian, I tried it with 3 bits of the peppers in there, and you really can't see anything. That's the one on the left. And then, of course, 7 bits of peppers is very obvious with the Dalmatian as well. So in this case, both pictures have to be the same size, one simply replacing the other, and then it's very easily detectable. In the more general case, you wouldn't do that. You would read bits from your hidden file and just stuff them in the least significant bits. And so even if someone were to look at slices, which we're going to do in a second, you wouldn't see another image. You would just see kind of random looking bits. Here's another way to detect it with a histogram. That's just a count of byte values. So here we go. You can see the pointer up there, right, on the screen. So over here is the count of zeros. Over here is the count of 255s and everything in between. So 128 is somewhere in there. So here's the mandrel histogram. And this is the full color image. This is all three colors together. And then here's the Dalmatian histogram. Well, now, here's the histogram for 1 bit of the Dalmatian hiding in 7 bits of the mandrel. And just looking at the histogram, you can clearly see there's some anomaly there. And then as you add more and more bits, it becomes noticeable that this histogram looks really strange as compared to the smooth histograms that you saw before. So this technique is very easily detectable. And then here's with 5, 6, and 7 bits. Of course, on the 7th bit here, it almost looks like the Dalmatian histogram. And then over here is just the Dalmatian by itself again. So just kind of transitioning from 0 to 8 bits there from one image to another. All right, this is just showing what conceptually slicing something into bit planes will look like. Like you take a section of pixels, some section, I don't know if this is 8 by 8, looks like more it's 12 by 12. And then you can kind of consider each bit a plane in and of itself. And we're going to use that shortly. But here's the mandrel with nothing hidden sliced into bit planes. So here's bit 7 alone. So you get the pointer going here. Bit 6 alone, bit 5 alone, and so forth. Okay. So you can see, with bit 7, that's most of the information. Bit 6 provides a lot, bit 5 some, and then from there it goes down, and down in the lower 3 bits, almost all random looking noise. And that's why we can replace those bits. There's the same thing with the peppers hidden. Certainly now, the top 4 bits you see the mandrel, and the bottom 4 bits you see the peppers. All right, any questions up to this point? Okay, going too fast or anything? Good? Okay. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about an advanced substitution technique, bit plane complexity segmentation. There's a number of papers out there on this type. I don't know, last time I checked, maybe 5 to 10 papers on various ways to do this. It's kind of interesting. Somebody will publish a paper. Someone will come out and figure out a way to break it. Someone will figure out a way to make it better, and it just keeps going. I'm sure as grad students, y'all are familiar with that type of process. As soon as you publish the unbreakable code, somebody comes along and breaks it. It's a little bit more advanced. It's kind of an adaptive LSB technique, and I leave out some details here for brevity. But basically, we're going to spread the message across several bit planes. Okay, and just looking again at the mandrel, the most significant bit, and the least significant bit here, and the Dalmatian, most significant bit, least significant bit, you can see that this has a lot of solid areas, okay, whereas this has a lot of noise-looking areas. Same thing for the Dalmatian, very solid, very noisy. And so what BPCS does, in a nutshell, is it measures a bit plane and says, is this complex? And if it's complex, meaning it looks kind of random, then the idea is that we can take our data we want to hide and replace the complex data in there, because visually, when you look at something complex from far away, you can't tell the difference. Like, in a newspaper, it puts a lot of black dots there to make it darker or lighter, and if the dots were slightly misaligned or turned around a little bit, from a distance, you're still going to see the same shade of gray, and really without being able to tell. And so that's kind of the concept behind BPCS. So basically, the image is sliced into bit planes, and a complexity measure is taken for each region. Typically, the region's 8 by 8, and 8 by 8 is a very frequent image block size. They've done experiments. JPEG uses 8 by 8. They've tried 16 by 16, 4 by 4, and it tends to come out that 8 by 8 blocks just are the best overall. Okay. And this complexity measurement used in this reference paper, the basic paper, is just a simple, what's called a border measurement. Okay, so basically, remember, we're on 1 bit plane, so you're going to have a 1 or 0. So it just counts how many changes there are. And it'll go in the vertical direction, how many changes are there, horizontal direction, how many changes are there, and then it determines the complexity by that. So solid white would have 0 complexity. no changes. Checkerboard pattern has the max complexity, and I think that's 112, if I recall correctly, in an 8 by 8 block. And so they use this complexity measurement and say, okay, is this complex? If it's not, then we go on to the next 8 by 8 block. And they do this for each bit plane. So they go at the bit 0, bit 1, bit 2, all the way down to bit 7. Okay? Although, as you saw, you're probably not going to find a lot hidden in bit 7 because there's not many complex areas. So here's the formula. Pretty simple. K is how many changes. M is the maximum. You get a ratio. Experimentally, the authors determined that the threshold to say that, yes, this is complex would be about 0.3. If it was less than that, then it wasn't complex enough. And if it was greater than that, then it was complex. Got to keep it less than 0.5. We'll see why shortly. And here's just a quick graphical example. Okay, the block on the left is not going to be very complex, not many changes. Block on the right, lots of changes, it's going to be more complex. So once it's determined that a region is complex enough, we take our data that we want to hide and replace it. Okay, so now these are 8 by 8 squares on a single bit plane, so we got 64 bits there. So we grab 64 bits of data and replace that. But now there's a problem during extraction. So any of you see what the problem during extraction is going to be? Yeah.
Known what the complex areas were on the original image before you hid the information inside of it?
Knowing where the... Well, I mean, you've got to be able to figure that out, but consider if the region's not complex, we leave it alone, and so the extractor comes along and measures it and says, with the same formula, same threshold, says, no, this is not complex, so it leaves it alone also. And then it comes across some data, it says, yes, this is complex, and so then it says, this is my data, and extracts it. So I think you're kind of onto it, but not quite.
So if the image is naturally complex, then it may confuse?
Now, if the image is naturally complex, then it says, yep, this 8 by 8 region is complex, and it replaces it with your hidden data.
You don't know where to extract that.
You don't know what to extract?
It extracted the hidden data, because the complexity is now not the original complexity, the complexity of the original picture, but now it's the complexity of your hidden data.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. When you hide your data, what if your original data is not complex? Now the extractor comes along and says, nope, this is not complex, and throws it out. Okay, so you have to deal with that solution. That's exactly what it is. And the way they deal with that, the solution they came up with was to conjugate the data. And basically, that's simply XORing the data with a checkerboard pattern. Okay, so this will guarantee that your data is complex enough, because when you conjugate it, if your complexity measurement was 0.2, now it's going to be 0.8. It's 1 minus alpha. Okay, and that's why you have to keep that complexity below the threshold below 0.5, because if you allowed a complexity of 0.6 before you said this was complex enough, and you put 0.55 there, when you conjugate 0.55, then you're going to get 0.45, and you're still not going to meet that 0.6 threshold. Yes?
What if you wanted to hide a checkerboard pattern?
Then it would already be complex enough. And so you have the original image and you say, this is complex. I grab my checkerboard pattern, replace it there, and when the complexity measurement is taken, it is also complex.
But you don't know that when you extract it, if you use the checkerboard pattern to make it more complex.
I think you're on to something which is coming up, because there is one more problem, and I think you're onto it. And that is, how do you know which data sections were conjugated? Okay. I'll get to that in just a second. This slide just kind of shows what the XOR process looks like. Here's the regular block of data, and here it wasn't complex enough. Here's the checkerboard pattern, and here's what it looks like XORed. So clearly XORed, it's very complex. And so what you're getting at is, well, which ones are conjugated and which ones are not? And that is a definite problem. The way these authors chose to solve that problem was they took one of the bits out of the matrix, it's 8 by 8, so there's 64 bits, decided we're going to take the 64th bit and set that to 0 or 1 based on whether it's been conjugated or not. Okay, kind of arbitrary is which one you choose. And so you lose one bit of capacity in order to do that. Some other solutions were proposed to have a conjugation map, but then you got to hide that in there, and you got to kind of resolve. It's like a recursive problem at a smaller level type stuff. I have not yet thought of another way to do it that would be better than this. I really don't like this because it really kind of stinks to grab 63 bits from your hidden message to hide it in there. 64 is such a nice even number. But in any case, that was the solution they came up with, and that worked. All right. So any other questions or comments about BPCS? Okay, I think we're doing all right on time this time. Transform domain. In the transform domain, we're going to hide in the significant parts of the data. In the substitution methods, we tried to hide in the noise or hide in places where you couldn't tell. Now in the transform domain, we're actually going to hide in more significant portions. Can be made a little bit more robust than simple substitution methods. Okay. Although the technique that I present here is not robust. If you go in there and mess with the coefficients, as we'll see, then you'll lose the message data. But there are techniques which are very robust. All right. There's a number of transforms that exist. A discrete cosine transform. How many of you have heard of that? Nobody? I mean, I'm sure Dr. Delpa's heard of it, so he's kind of excluded. But okay, all right. What about the discrete Fourier transform? Anybody heard of that? A few people? Okay. Laplace? All right, a couple controls people in here. And the discrete wavelet transform? Anybody heard of that? Just come on, raise your hand high for this. Anybody heard of that? You have, with what? What's it used for? I'm sorry? Yeah? Do you know what, well, it's used with JPEG 2000. How many of you even heard of JPEG 2000? Supposedly it's better than the discrete cosine transform, but it hasn't caught on. The programs will probably have an option, like the new graphics programs have an option to save something in JPEG 2000 format, but apparently people are happy with JPEG and they haven't switched over for the slight increase in fidelity or compression ratio. And then a few others, Mellon Fourier, I don't know, some more odd transforms, and I'm sure there's plenty more than that. In any case, for this presentation, you don't need to know about all those, just the discrete cosine transform. And I'll give you a refresher. I'm sure the undergrad students haven't heard about it either. All right, so a little bit about JPEG and how it works. Here we have this 8x8 block again. Okay, so JPEG takes the image and divides it into 8x8 blocks. I'm looking for my mouse cursor here. I don't see it. Oh, there it is. Doesn't seem to want to appear over here. Well, there we go.
It's going very fast.
Okay. All right. There's my 8x8 block. Okay. This is a quantization table, which we'll see again, but it basically converts this colors to 3 different planes. Okay. We get a luminance value, which is kind of a grayscale. So you imagine pulling out the grayscale part of the JPEG, and then a couple of chrominance values. So we end up with 3 color planes. On each color plane, the discrete cosine transform is performed. Okay, and you get a little bit of loss there because, as you know, cosines produce numbers that not repeat, but just continue to have digits and so forth. So you cut it off to get integers. Then you quantize it. That's where you get most of the loss in the JPEG lossy compression algorithm, is with quantization. Then you run length encode it. Anybody know what run length encoding is? Haven't had a data compression class? Okay. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then you entropy encode it. Okay. And then you end up with the final compressed file. These encoding schemes down here, run length and entropy coding, are all lossless compression techniques. And the DCT and the quantization is where the lossy part happens. So JPEG is actually a hybrid. It actually does some lossy compression, and then it does some lossless compression in the end. And this is basically the words behind what I just said. I guess the last bullet there, a 2-dimensional discrete cosine transform is performed on each color plane. So we'll do that for the luminance values, and it will do that for each of the chrominance color planes. All right, so for more technically minded, DCT is kind of a correlation between the data and various frequencies. And we'll see the formula in a second. So you see, how well does this data correlate with low frequency? How well does the data correlate with high frequency? And that's essentially what a DCT transform is. Really, a Fourier transform is the same thing, except it has the imaginary component, and the DCT only has the cosine component. Also, since the images are two-dimensional, when you perform this on an image, you use the two-dimensional version. I guess if you're into advanced graphics and 3D graphics, then you might use a three-dimensional discrete cosine transform. But then the question is, what is frequency when considering an image? I say I'm going to correlate with frequencies. Well, when considering an image, what is frequency?
It's not color.
What?
It's not simply the color of the image.
Nope. Not simply the color. Well, I mean, it's related. I know you got colors are certain frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum, but that's not really. For instance, if I had something image that was a block of red, then there's no frequency there. If I have an image that's a block of blue, there's no frequency there either. Anybody else have an idea of what would frequency mean with respect to an image?
How often a color is repeated in an image?
How often the colors are featured?
How often it will be repeated in an image, that will be its frequency?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, you're kind of on the right track there. Basically, it's how much change is there. Okay, so saying, well, how often does a color featured, then how much change is there? So, for instance, in a grayscale image, you may have some parts of the image that are black. You may have some parts of the image that are white. And so you can imagine if you slowly shaded from black to white across the whole image, that's going to be a low frequency. But if you go directly from black to white, then that's going to be a high frequency because you have a rapid change all the way from white is 255 all the way down to 0, which is black, as typical representation. Okay, so high frequency is rapid change, low frequency is a slow change. A blue sky is going to have a low frequency. A lion in the jungle with, you got the color of the lion, and you got brightness, and you got darkness of the jungle, and transitioning between those two as an example, that's going to be a higher frequency. Okay. The last thing to note, I guess, in the last bullet there is that the DCT spatially correlates to frequencies. That's because typically an image is going to have pixels that, in a given area are going to be similar. Okay, because when you try to compress something, you're looking for pattern. And so if you were just to grab pixels from all over the image, the chance of having some kind of pattern is a lot less. And the idea with compression is we want to find pattern and then find ways to encode that pattern so we can encode it in much less space. So that's why you got the fancy spatially correlate stuff. Of course, with video, then you also temporally correlate it. I'll leave that for Star Trek. All right, here's the forward equation for the discrete cosine transform. I need to find my pointer again. I'm moving it slowly. Do you see it anywhere?
Down low, lower right hand.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. All right, it's hard to see because the light is shining in my face. All right, so here's the formula. I know it looks complicated, but it's kind of like calculus. It's easy once you figure it out. All right, a sub xy, that's our point. Okay, that's our pixel image. And for the computer science folks, you may recognize implementing a summation is just nothing but a for loop. So I've got two for loops in here. For y equals 0 to n minus 1, if n's 8, that's 7. And then for x equals 0 to 7. So I got two for loops. How many times is this going to loop? Quickly. How many times? Louder. Okay, n squared, which is 64, right? 8 times 8 is 64. Okay, so it's going to loop 64 times. And you notice in the cosine there's an x component in there and a y component. So as x and y get bigger, this is going to be a higher frequency correlation. When x and y are 0, cosine goes to 1. And then there's also a u and v component. Okay, u and v is the output matrix. And we're going to get an output matrix of equal size to the input matrix. So u and v are also going from 0 to 7 and 0 to 7. So now, really, for every 8 by 8 block, for the quick-minded, how many loops? We've got 8 squared in here times 8 squared out there. That's 8 to the 4th. So let's see, 8 to the 4th is 2 to the 3rd to the 4th. 3 times 4 is 12. 2 to the 12th, who knows what that is? 4K? 4096? All right. So for every 8 by 8 block, this is going to actually loop 4096 times. All right, so and then it's multiplied by these scaling factors that follow these rules over here. Okay, so the basic idea is we're going to take in these pixels of an image. We're going to get, let's just say, the luminance plane, and we're going to perform this DCT on it, and we're going to output a matrix. Okay, and the goal is that in the output matrix, a lot of the values go to 0. Okay, so then when a lot of values go to 0, now we've got a pattern, and now we can compress it. Okay, so that's the heart of JPEG right there, is that we're going to apply this discrete cosine transform, and in the output, many times, more times than not, we're going to get a matrix that has a few values and the rest are all zeros. Now that's not true for all matrices, and that's also going to depend on the quality factor, which we'll talk about briefly. So then, as it says, the results are quantized according to the desired quality. Okay, when you have a low quality JPEG, you use a larger value in the quantization table, and so you're dividing by a larger number, and so you result in more zeros, but less detail. So I don't know, how many of you have seen low quality JPEGs? They're kind of fuzzy. You might see the blockiness. So, okay, at least one person. And then, of course, high quality JPEGs look really good. But then they take more space. So the higher the quality, the less the compression. It's kind of a trade-off. So then, once it quantizes it based on the desired quality value, they run length encode it. As I mentioned, there's a lot of zeros. So instead of transmitting 50 zeros, we'll transmit 1 0 and say the count 50. Or actually, since we know it's a 0, because 0 is the only number that's going to appear like this, we don't even have to transmit the 0. We can just put in there and code a 50. So now we've taken a few pixel values, 8 by 8 pixels, and turn it into a few values, and then with 50 zeros, and then you take that and apply a WinZip type compression to it. Huffman coding is typically used. Arithmetic coding is sometimes used. And then that's how you end up with this very good compression ratio. So the restored image is very similar when you look at it, but mathematically completely different. Now, this says transform technique number 2. Since I was concerned about time, I hid a couple slides that were transform technique number 1. If you download the presentation itself, they're in there. And there's other techniques too. If you look up hiding in JPEGs, you'll find a number of papers on that. But I kind of like this technique, and I adapted it for my class. It's an adaptive discrete cosine transform least significant bit technique. But rather than hiding in the least significant bit of the pixels, it hides in the least significant bit of the discrete cosine transform coefficients. And it's adaptive. All right, so first it does this capacity estimation. Okay, it says how much can I hide in these particular discrete cosine transform coefficients. And it uses both the quantization table and the coefficients themselves. So basically it takes a log base 2 on the quantization table and gets a number. Okay? And then it takes a log base 2 of the discrete cosine transform, the magnitude of it, since you can't take a log of a negative number, it just gets the magnitude. And says how many can I hide in there? What's that value? And takes the lower of the 2. Okay? So it's kind of based on both the quantization table and the actual discrete cosine transform values. Here on the screen now is just some of the symbols. Q is the quantization table, C is the ultimate capacity, M is the max number of bits, D is the DCT coefficient, and E is the number of bits that can be embedded. And so we'll see that a little better here. All right, so here we have a table, and this is a quantization table. Okay, and I just arbitrarily picked X and Y direction here. And so we take the log, for each individual element of this table, we take the log base 2 of that. And we can also factor it with an alpha value, which we'll see. You can pick alpha. In experimentation, I've gotten alpha up to about 4. And once I go higher than 4, perception starts to be easy. Okay, so I generally keep it between 2 and 4 to scale the quantization table by. And then we get the log base 2 of the DCT coefficient itself, the corresponding one. So if we get the log base 2 of 16, that's going to be a 4. And then we get the log base 2 of the corresponding DCT value, which is the smallest one. That's how many bits we can hide. So then we substitute our message bits into the bits of the DCT coefficient. So in this example here, let's say that I use this quantization table value of 11, which is right there. Take the log base 2 of that, take the floor, round it off, or not round it, but just take the floor, and that gives you a 3. 2 to the third is 8, 2 to the fourth is 16. If the corresponding DCT coefficient happens to be a 70, I take the log base 2 of that, I get 6. Well, 3 is less than 6, so I can hide 3 bits in there. And so I take my message bits and replace the lower 3 bits of this 70 with the 3 bits of my message. And I do that for every one of these. Okay? Now in a low quality JPEG, most of these down here in the lower right hand corner are going to be 0 anyway, and I can't hide in 0. Log of 0 is undefined, and so of course in the program you want to avoid doing that or else it crashes and so forth. Can't hide with just 1. If it's a 1, it might go to 0 and then it gets encoded differently. So you need it to be at least a 2 to even hide there. So low quality JPEG, you're going to have a few coefficients to hide in. High quality JPEG, you're going to have a lot more of these coefficients to hide in, and you'll see kind of the capacity of the high quality versus the low quality shortly. And so it does that for each 8x8 block and then for each color plane. Okay. A few other things. This author had a block classification technique where he said, let's measure the complexity of this block, and if it's higher complexity, then we can hide a little bit more, so it tweaks the values a little bit. If it's lower complexity, then we can't. And so basically divided the blocks into 2 classes, either uniform or non-uniform. And if it was a non-uniform block, we could assign a little bit larger alpha value. Okay. Now, here we got that problem again. If we go and change the value of the actual DCT coefficients, when I come back to measure the uniformity later, now it may not come out the same. It may not meet that threshold. Okay. So in my implementation of this paper's algorithm, what I did was I just used the upper 4 bits for uniformity measurement, and I limited my hiding to the lower 4 bits. So I lose a little bit of capacity, but then I don't have any problems with which block is uniform and not uniform because I don't alter the upper 4 bits. So my calculation during embedding is the same as during extraction. But that's what this formula is here. The G, that's the threshold. So that's the calculation, and then you meet some threshold, which the paper doesn't tell you. So you just have to experiment with that. But you add up all the DCT coefficients from 1 to 63. You leave out the 0 coefficient. That's usually the largest, and so they left that out of the measurement there. And take the square root. That's just a kind of a root mean square technique. And then you see if it's above a threshold, it's uniform. If it's below a threshold, it's not uniform, type of thing. Well, I mentioned this already. Now, the author with this problem, the way he solved it was to modify the quantization table and set the last byte value in the quantization table to a 1. Well, that's great, except of course that's a very easy detectable signature, right? You find a 1 in there, you just look in the quantization table, find the 1, and say, hey, this has got something wrong with it, because usually that wouldn't happen. Okay, so I did the solution as I mentioned already. All right, so here's the original. Anybody been there before? Joel, all right. Nobody else, at least nobody that wants to admit it, right? Yeah, I was there, but I don't want to tell anybody. All right. Yeah, it stays there. All right, so there's the original. And here's with a quality of 90. Okay. Now, I found through experimentation with this program that low-quality JPEGs don't work too well for hiding. I can't hide very much without it being noticed, and we'll see that. So I set this one at quality. And I set alpha equals 1, and I set the uniformity factor to 1. That's what the A and the U are. And I hid with about 1% capacity. So there's really not much change to detect. Now, what about this one? Can you tell there's something weird about it? This one I bumped alpha up to 4 and U up to 4. And I got close to a 20% capacity, which is pretty good. If you have a 3 megabyte JPEG, well, let's make the math easy. If you have a 4 megabyte JPEG, then 20% capacity is what, about 800K? That's a pretty reasonable capacity with that. And you can't really see it. Can't really tell. If you were to compare this image to the original, you could probably notice some slight variations in some of the pixels. But if you just had those two and I said which one has the data hidden, one or the other, but you can't really pick out which one. You don't know which one is right and which one is wrong. All right, let's look at 50% quality. Here's the original 50% quality. Looks pretty good, right? Does it look pretty good there? Okay. Now here's with alpha is 1 and U is 1. Can you see anything there? Can you see a difference? I can on the monitor. I can see at least on this monitor, I can see the sky kind of less uniform. See the sky kind of little bands in the sky a bit. Okay. And then with alpha equals 4 and U equals 4, I think it's pretty clear, even to the casual observer, that there's something going on. You know, the other image, if you just received an email, you might go, yeah, maybe it's just low quality. This one looks pretty strange. Okay, I found through experimentation that about 70 or 75% quality was kind of the cutoff. If I got below that, it started being perceptible fairly easy, and then above that was generally pretty good. All right, what do we have? Oh, we're up with 50 minutes now, right?
If you can continue a little bit, there might be the recording may end, but
Okay, well, this is just a few slides here, and this is the last one. I wanted to present an audio technique. Of course, with audio, you can hide in the least significant bit also. You tend to hear it more quickly, kind of like the old cassette tapes. I don't know. I guess some of you know what a cassette tape is. I don't know about all of you, especially the undergrad students out there. But you could hear a lot of noise, shh type noise on cassette tapes. As you hide in the least significant bit of audio, you start hearing that kind of noise very quickly. It's not like an image where you can replace, 16-bit audio, replace the lower 8 bits. You will hear that quite loudly. So this technique, echo hiding, is fairly old. It's been around, I don't know, it's probably one of the beginning techniques back in 95, 96. This guy named Bender and Gruhl came up with it. But I thought it was kind of interesting. So as I mentioned, the human auditory system is very sensitive, but it's not as sensitive to phase. And so what they decided to do is let's take an echo and let's hide an echo in this audio file as opposed to manipulating the least significant bits. All right, so basically we take an echo is nothing but the original sound delayed in time and reduced in amplitude. Okay, so you're going to hide in an echo. You produce an echo by taking some block of sound file and saying, okay, let's take that waveform and let's shrink the amplitude down, and then let's put that in there, but somewhat delayed in time. And you can alter the delays in time, or I guess the amplitude, and use that to hide your bit. One delayed, 1 millisecond is 1 bit, and one delayed half a millisecond, as an example, maybe a 0 bit, something like that. And so, this just shows a magnitude, and let's see, here's 10 milliseconds. I guess I'm down in the lower, there we go. Okay, 10 milliseconds, and then the echo, 20 milliseconds. It's just the reverb control on your stereo, for some of those that mess with that. And there's 3 parameters that can be varied. Of course, you can vary the initial amplitude, you can vary the decay rate, how fast it goes down in amplitude, and you could vary the time delay. They found through experimentation that they needed to keep the time delay under 3 milliseconds in order for it to not be perceptible. Once you start delaying it more than that, then the human ear can start picking up these echoes. And so basically, we just use different delays to represent different ones. So here's a 0, here's a 1, and you embed that in there. And that's the easy part. That's pretty easy. Probably all of you could write a program that would take a block of sound, reduce the amplitude, and delay it in time and add it back in. I mean, it's very simple. Hard part is detecting it. In any case, this just kind of gives the basic algorithm divided into segments, and you create a 0 echo signal and a 1. So basically the same signal, delayed in time and reduced in amplitude. And you have those going as you're going through the audio file. And then the secret message controls the mixer. And these are the mixer signals. And we'll see the graphic in a minute. I think it'll make it a little bit clearer. But then as your message comes in into 1, basically the 1 mixer signal turns on and the 0 mixer signal turns off. And as your message is a 0, then that one turns off and that one turns on. So basically we're going along adding, we're adding here the 1 echo, and then we transition and add the 0 echo here, and we add the 1 echo here, and so forth. And because of this slope, it provides a smooth transition. So here we have the 1 echo, here we have the 0 echo, that's showing a mixed in. So this is the message. The message is controlling these 2 mixers. And it just adds that, and of course this can all be done digitally. It doesn't have to be done in real time or anything, although with this setup it could be done in real time. And then you get the encoded signal. Pretty straightforward, pretty basic, pretty easy. Tough part is decoding the message on the receiving end and finding those echoes. Okay, now certainly if you had the original, you could compare the original to the encoded one and pull it out. But without having that, the way to decode it is to calculate the cepstrum. So how many of you have heard of the cepstrum before? You've heard of spectrum, right? It's kind of a mangled version of spectrum. I found, and maybe Dr. Delp would be able to help me out, I found a couple references to cepstrum that give the formula differently. but it's something along the lines of the log of the magnitude of the discrete Fourier transform or some crazy thing like that. I don't have the formulas up here, but I found 2 different references on the internet that showed 2 different values. In any case, you get this, you do that calculation, and then you do an autocorrelation with that, which is just correlating it with itself. And then you check the magnitude and find where the magnitude is different. And so the authors kind of produce this graph and saying, okay, after we do the auto-cepstrum, they called it, which is the autocorrelation of the cepstrum, then we get one delay here to represent a 1 bit or a 0 bit, either one, and then a different delay here to represent that. So they were able to recover the signal. All right. Well, there's some techniques. There's a lot of techniques out there, many more than I even cover in my course. I do cover more than that in the course. Many more out there, and many more to come, I'm sure. So anybody have any questions or comments? I do have that at the end of the presentation, some of the major papers that were used, to give credit where credit is due.
So I'm a music fan.
All
I
right.
know that record labels, when they send out some advanced copies to the music publications for review, and they're finding that these are then making their way onto the internet and for illegal downloading
Right.
prior to an album release. I know that the record labels are actually using this now in making each copy that goes to each publication have a hidden code, I guess,
Right.
in the audio, so they can then go, when they find it on the internet afterwards,
Illegal copies, they can
yes,
identify
they
them.
can then trace it back to where
Right.
it came from.
That's called the fingerprinting, and that's in the watermarking domain more so than the steganographic domain. I mean, really, the 2 domains are the same thing. It's just with different goals. Watermarking wants to be robust, be able to identify the owner. Sometimes they use it for copyright protection to identify the owner. Sometimes you want to identify who you've given this to and fingerprint them. And steganography wants high capacity and doesn't really care about robustness. And I mentioned, I think I've found roughly 2,500 papers on steganography. Watermarking is probably at least 5, if not 10 times that, because of the large commercial interest in digital rights management as a whole, which, I don't know, my personal opinion, it's more or less doomed to failure. But, I mean, iTunes, you can't play them except on your registered computers. Oh, but you can write it to a CD and then burn it anywhere to an MP3. And so, in any case, make it cheap, make it easily available, and then people will pay for it. All right, any other questions or comments? All right, thank you very much for coming.